Gandhi's Passion: The Life and Legacy of Mahatma Gandhi by Stanley Wolpert. Introduction. Suffering and the suffering of pain are the primary definitions of passion. The first example of the word passion in the Oxford English Dictionary is the sufferings of Jesus Christ on the cross. The story of Mahatma Gandhi's life may be read as a pageant of his conscious courting of suffering. Gandhi's life of passion also ended in martyrdom. Gandhi's passion has Indian historical roots that predate Jesus by more than 2000 years. Hinduism's great god Shiva, yogic lord of beasts and of the dance, was first depicted on an Indus Valley seal dating back to the 3rd millennium BC. Among the skills honed by yogis, including breath and mind control, none is more potent or important than tapas, a Sanskrit word meaning suffering. When first used in the Rig Veda, tapas meant heat, the self incubating creative power that gave birth to an ancient India's first monoistic neuter god, Ekam, that one. In subsequent sacred texts, tapas refers to yogic powers of contemplation and meditation whose laser like beams were, it appears, hot enough to awaken even a neutered divinity to life. Soon after launching his monumental Satyagraha, Hold Fast to the Truth, movement in South Africa, Gandhi resolved, as he wrote in 1906, that sacrifice was the law of life. He gave up his pleasures as a British barrister, his Savile Row suits, and sexual relations with his wife, vowing to focus all the heat of his passion towards helping India's emigre and indentured community living in Natal and the Transvaal win freedom from racial prejudice and discrimination. Gandhi's elder brother felt betrayed and abandoned by the young man he had so generously supported for 3 years while he studied law in London. Gandhi's wife and eldest son found it impossible to understand his courting hatred and violent contempt in his selfless service to the Indian community. They could not fathom his eagerness to give up his fortune and every comfort of home and hearth to break evil laws and then warmly welcome long prison terms. Gandhi's passion turned each prison cell he occupied into a self proclaimed temple or palace, even as he taught his self sacrificing yogic spirit to relish the delicious taste of fasting, taking pleasure in every pain he suffered for the common good. Gandhi won the early admiration and active support of the greatest liberal leaders of India's National Congress, a body that also included a radical revolutionary wing whose members were repelled by his scrupulous insistence on nonviolence. Other more conservative Anglophile Indians, of course, found Gandhi's rejection of Western garb and his prison record abhorrent. But after 20 years of successfully leading the Indian struggle in South Africa, Gandhi returned to India during World War I to widespread acclaim for the passionate courage he displayed during a series of satyagraha campaigns against injustice in Gujarat and Bihar. Soon after the war ended, he was ready to assume supreme command of the Congress, rewriting its constitution and transforming its mostly moderate political reform lobby into a mighty mass movement, demanding freedom for India from British imperial exploitation and domination. But after acquiring more political power than any other Indian of the previous century of British rule had enjoyed, he rejected all the power prerequisites coveted by others the world over. He refused to travel any way but by foot or in third class railway carriages and retreated to the Spartan simplicity of remote village ashrams he founded whenever he was not jailed in a British prison. Gandhi's seemingly eccentric or, at any rate, curiously contradictory behavior, his rejection of all normal pleasures, acquisitive and sensual, and his oft repeated retreat from the brink of victory can best be understood in the light of his passionate resolve to suffer and experience in daily life all the pain and deepest sorrow sustained by India's poorest peasants and outcasts. He shivered naked in winter, as they did, and bore the scalding heat of central India's summers without complaint. When the Congress offered him complete control over its national machinery and the crown of its presidency, he invariably declined, grooming younger men to wear what he called the crown of thorns. He abandoned the organization he had revitalized when it became too high and mighty, too rich and greedy for his passionate nature. By recreating himself through the power of his passion, in the humble, vulnerable image of India's poorest, starving, naked millions, Gandhi could, when moved to do so by his inner voice, call upon that unarmed, ragged army whose pain he mirrored and magnified in his own naked body, to follow him barefoot up India's Via Dolorosa to freedom. And countless millions unhesitatingly did follow him, not as a modern political leader, nor as a medieval native prince or marshal Maharaja, but as their own Mahatma, India's great soul, the only title he ever enjoyed until even that became too burdensome and honorific for his passionate spirit. The purer the suffering, tapas, Gandhi believed, the greater the progress. Hence did the sacrifice of Jesus suffice to free a sorrowful world. If India wishes to see the kingdom of God established on earth, instead of that of Satan which has enveloped Europe, we must go through suffering. Brilliant yogi that he was, Gandhi resolved to pit the passionate powers of his sublimated suffering spirit against the world's mightiest empire. His creative religious genius allowed him to unite the mainstream of Western passion with India's traditional tapas, synthesizing both forms of suffering within his great soul. He turned himself into a cauldron of pain, so brilliantly illuminating as to endow him with an aura of goodness and light, magnetizing millions to enter prison without flinching when he called, and to die for him if he ever asked. But the meaning of Western passion, much like the semantic evolution of tapas, which shifted nuance from heat with hellish connotations to suffering, soon came to embrace opposites of emotions. Feelings like desire and aversion, hope and fear, love and hatred. Gandhi's passion proved similarly ambivalent. He struggled throughout his mature life to subdue his strong sexual drive, believing that intercourse with his wife for any reason other than procreation was evil. His antipathy to every form of violence, moreover, made him most acutely sensitive to the potential violence of sexual brutality. Here, too, he probed ancient India's deep roots for a remedy, finding it, he felt, in brahmacharya, celibate studenthood, the first stage of a traditional upper caste Hindu's life prior to his sexual initiation through marriage. Gandhi strove to return to and remain in that chaste state for more than the last 4 decades of his life, struggling most passionately to adhere to his vow of total abstinence. Gandhi equated ahimsa, non-violence, or as he preferred to define it, love with God. He also believed that truth, satya, is God, devoting most of his life to the passionate quest of seeing God by living in perfect harmony with his golden attributes. Gandhi's passionate embrace of tapas, moreover, taught him to forget fear. He incorporated that fearless mantra into his life's mission of to liberate his followers from fear's self-imposed shackles, as well as those more easily visible chains forged by foreign tyranny. Armed with ahimsa, satya, and tapas, Gandhi transformed his frail naked body and fearless soul into an all but impregnable fortress. In choosing the subtitle for his autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, however, and as evident throughout that book, Gandhi readily revealed how often he erred in his personal as well as his public life. Whenever he detected some imperfection or sensed he had made a strategic mistake, what he called a Himalayan blunder, in prematurely launching Satyagraha. He never hesitated to admit his error and to reverse his course, obeying his inner voice, which he believed was the voice of God. Reaching so ideally high, adhering to adamantly to noble principles and what he called purity of means, Gandhi failed to achieve all he hoped for India. But the passion of his life was the legacy he left to his country and to the world, inspiring millions with the grandeur of his dream and some few disciples with an ardent love of suffering on their own painfully narrow road to martyrdom. In Gandhi's passion lies the key to his inner temple of pain. He suffered joyfully, guarding his dream to someday restore the epic golden age of goodness and truth to Mother India. And through the multifaceted prison of his passion, Gandhi's tragic weakness is revealed as the other side of his singular strength, helping to account for his final failure, that for which he worked hardest and suffered most. Chapter 1, Midnight in Calcutta. Mahatma Gandhi fell into darkest despair on the eve of India's independence in August 1947. Savage fighting spread from Punjab and the northwest frontier to eastern Bengal and Bihar. Brutal violence unleashed a year earlier by Muslim thugs in Calcutta had triggered Hindu counterattacks and the murder of more Muslims in Bihar. Mayhem, rape, and murder spread to the villages of Bengal as well, each report inciting more massacres of innocents as communal hatred raged across most of South Asia's subcontinent. On July 17, 1947, acting on the advice of India's Prime Minister in waiting, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the consent of Pakistan's Governor General to be Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Viceroy Lord Mountbatten won his government's final approval to partition Punjab and Bengal along religious lines prior to Great Britain's withdrawal from India. Their plan to carve up British India was never approved of or accepted by Gandhi, however, who realized too late that his closest comrades and disciples were more interested in power than principle, and that his own vision had long been clouded by the illusion that the struggle he led for India's freedom was a non-violent one. Who listens to me today? A despondent Gandhi muttered. And why should anyone? To disillusioned devotees, the Mahatma, great soul, freely confessed his bankruptcy, admitting that he lived in a fool's paradise. Nonetheless, the 77-year-old little father, Bapu, of his nation did not surrender to sorrow. Great soul that he was, Gandhi carried on passionately, ignoring daily threats to his life, refusing to silence his criticism of the government, and rejecting appeals to remain in New Delhi to celebrate the dawn of India's freedom at midnight on the 15th of August 1947. What is there to celebrate? This vivisection of the mother, as he called partition, was fit only for prayer and deep heart searching, not for fireworks, proud speeches, and songs. Gandhi had tried to win Nehru over to his faith in the virtues of simple living, urging his aristocratic Anglophile heir to give up India's democratic throne, abandon the great house he planned to occupy, and instead move into a village hut. He argued, I believe that if India, and through India the world, is to achieve real freedom, then we shall have to go and live in the villages, in huts, not in palaces. Gandhi feared now that India was approaching its doom, whirling moth like around the hot light of power till its wings would burn. His duty was to save India from that sad fate, though he well understood it might take his last passionate breath. As Delhi draped itself in miles of festive electric lights and the saffron white and green bunting of India's bright national flag, symbolizing wishful Hindu Sikh Muslim unity. Bapu entrained for Bengal on his lonely pilgrimage of prayer for peace. What to do was the mantra he muttered daily that November as he walked barefoot through the blood soaked mud of Noakhali district's scorched villages in eastern Bengal's anguished delta. He had gone there in response to his old Quaker friend Muriel Lester's personal plea, made after she had met Hindu widows who had watched their husbands butchered by Muslims. Before their husbands could be cremated, those widows were dragged off to be converted and married to the same killers. These women had a dead look, Muriel wrote him, a look of utter blankness. Gandhi soon saw worse things in Noakhali. Believing as he did that truth is God, he could not understand how so much he thought true about India turned out to be so violently false. Lured back to Delhi by appeals from the new viceroy seeking Gandhi's wise advice on how to stop the killings. Bapu offered it, but Mountbatten was staggered by what this naked old fool told him. He consulted Nehru, who explained that the old boy was out of touch and could hardly be taken seriously when he urged the viceroy immediately to replace his own Congress ally and heir with their most hated Muslim League enemy, Jinnah. Mountbatten agreed, understanding little more about India than what Nehru's closest comrade, V.K. Krishna Menon, and his own clever wife, Lady Edwina, explained to him. They all agreed that Gandhi was a saint, but saints should never indulge in practical politics or govern nations, should they? Gandhi realized soon enough that it was all a charade, a polite royal brush off once the tea party ended. The carriages were called and the servants escorted him down the garden path. That was when he decided to leave Delhi and return to Noakhali, where he was at least listened to, if not worshipped by villagers too uneducated to be insincere, too timid for flattery or duplicity, too poor to fear that he wanted anything from them. These were the people he loved best and felt most at ease and at home among. Mostly naked with no possessions to worry about losing. They had not anything to hide. They were as remote from regal Mountbattens and Nehrus as Noakhali from New Delhi. But before reaching Noakhali, his train steamed into Calcutta's noisy, bustling station, arriving 5 hours late in that smoky, magnificent city of dreadful night. Imperial bullies later hammered her into the richest, sexiest, sickest capital of the grandest empire on earth, built along the wrong side of the river named Hooghly, atop dung filled mud at whose ancient womb worshippers of the mother goddess Kali laid petals of puja and slaughtered sacrificial goats and lambs. Gandhi considered all modern cities satanic, the ugliest fruit of Western civilization. He had long sought refuge from their soul crushing noise, industrial speed, and poisonous air, preferring the harmony of India's ancient village community. And the train ride he adamantly refused to fly was exhausting. Noisy crowds awaiting his arrival at every stop, shoving, shouting, banging at his carriage windows. Even a glimpse of the Mahatma, his darshan, was considered a blessing to devout Hindus. He tried to wave them off and to spin or pray in peace, but they never left him alone, testing his patience, causing him often to lose it, making him shout angrily at them through toothless gums. Too tired to move on immediately to East Bengal, he got into a car that was waiting at Calcutta station to drive him to suburban Sodipur, where his Bengali disciple Satish Chandra Das Gupta had established a retreat for the hand spinning of cotton. He never planned far ahead. One step enough for me, he often said, quoting the last words of the hymn he loved best. Lead Kindly Light by Cardinal Newman. He waited at all times for instructions from his inner voice before making his next move. Only now he heard many voices, mostly those of anxious Muslims importuning him to stay in Calcutta. The Muslim minority there feared that the transfer of power to a Hindu Congress government in West Bengal would revive riots that had started a year ago on 16th August. That was proclaimed Direct Action Day by Qaid Azam, great leader, Jinnah, president of the Muslim League. Of all his failures, the one Gandhi regretted most was not convincing Jinnah of the error of his insistence on partition, the dreadful operation that was to bring Pakistan to birth by virtually bleeding Mother India to death. If only Mountbatten and Nehru had agreed last April to tempt Jinnah by offering him the premier crown of thorns. Now it was too late, and the sole penance Gandhi could perform was to spend the remaining days of his life in Pakistan trying to protect minorities there from extortion and violence by Muslim majority. He resolved to leave India, moving either to Karachi or Lahore on that final pilgrimage. But first, he would visit Nokhali, once again to bring what little comfort his unarmed presence could to Hindus living there in daily fear of death. Calcutta's anxieties that the previous year's orgy of terror would be repeated, however, inspired him now to launch one of his most creative initiatives in problem solving. The man most widely blamed for the mass murder of Hindus and the torching of their property in the days and weeks following Direct Action Day was Bengal's Muslim League Chief Minister Hussain Shahid Soharwardi. Every British officer, including Governor Sir Frederick Burrows and Chief of the Eastern Command, Lieutenant General Sir Francis Tucker, pointed to Soharwardi as the villain of the terror that exploded after he gave Calcutta's police a special holiday to celebrate direct action. What those self righteous British officers failed to explain, of course, was why the army they commanded was kept in barracks until the rioters had done their worst work. As soon as troops did show themselves marching through the streets up Garden Reach, Tia Bruce, Beleghatia, and along the lower circular road, The killers slipped away. Calcutta's Marwari Hindu merchants and bankers also pointed fingers at Soharwardi. So did their sycophants in every court and bazaar, who soon hired their own thugs to wreak vengeance on Muslim quarters of the city, gutting homes and shops there for months. Soharwardi by now was stripped of Calcutta's chief ministership, replaced by Dr. Prafulla Chandra Ghosh, leader of the West Bengal's Hindu Congress majority provincial government. Nor would Soharwardi be picked to become Chief Minister of East Pakistan. His less popular Muslim League rival Khwaja Nazimuddin had been selected instead by Jinnah to take that post in Dhaka. Jinnah knew that Soharwardi's dream had been to preside over an independent nation of Bengal, Bangladesh, a new nation state he had lobbied hard to have carved out of eastern quarter of British India. His vision was to integrate Hindu majority West Bengal and Muslim majority East Pakistan into a single unified land of Bengali speakers whose language and culture would transcend any differences of religious doctrine or practice. Mountbatten, however, refused even to consider Soharwardi's brilliant plan, just as he had ignored Gandhi's proposal to replace Nehru with Jinnah. Though Suharwardi's dream of becoming the king of Bengal was thus aborted, he lived to emerge less than a decade later, but only briefly to remain as Prime Minister of Pakistan. He was removed by martial coup and died a few years later in Beirut. Gandhi had long known and liked Suharwardi, who for 3 decades had admired him as well. So when Muslim friends pressed him to stay on in Calcutta, at least until after Independence Day, the Mahatma agreed to do so on one condition, that Shahid Soharwardi share the same roof with him so that they could appeal to Muslims and Hindus alike to live in peace in this greatest of all Indian cities. Adversity makes strange bedfellows, Gandhi told his prayer meeting that August 11th. Soharwardi agreed and they moved into the abandoned Haidari house, a once splendid residence whose terrified Muslim owners had fled, leaving it to be robbed and ruined by looters and hoodlums. They seemed an odd couple, and almost naked Babu and Bengal's Big Daddy dressed meticulously in his white linen or beige silk suits. But Gandhi's genius for symbolic gestures was never wiser than this experiment in Hindu Muslim cohabitation. It visibly demonstrated to Calcutta's millions of angry and fearful Hindus and Muslims alike that a Mahatma and the Muslim League leader, most often blamed for instigating the worst of last year's riots, could peacefully live under a single roof. They stayed there together for almost a week, answering the most hostile, angry questions as honestly as they could, as fearlessly as both of these remarkable men had lived all their lives. It proved to be a potent lesson in the practical possibility of peaceful coexistence, cooperation, and the powers of love. Of the lessons Gandhi had labored most of his life to teach, this was one of the most important. The interlude with Soharwardi, however, was his last demonstration of the miraculous force of love and the value of trust and faith in one's fellow man, as well as in truth. Pacifist Horace Alexander, whose leadership of the Society of Friends had first brought him to India in 1929, was invited by Gandhi to join them in Haidari House, where Alexander proved useful in helping to keep crowds of irate Hindus from breaking in that first night. Why have you come here? They shouted at Gandhi. Why did you not go to places from where the Hindus have fled? I have come here to serve not only Muslims but Hindus, he explains. The hooligans told him to go away, but Gandhi was never easily dissuaded or intimidated from doing what he believed to be right. You can obstruct my work, even kill me. I won't invoke the help of the police. You can prevent me from leaving this house, but what is the use of your dubbing me an enemy of the Hindus? I will not accept the label. The Mahatma then asked them what good it would do now to avenge the wrongs committed in 1946. On August 14th, Gandhi argued again with the young Hindus who had so angrily challenged him the previous day. By evening, he had won their hearts and minds. What a spellbinder this old man is, one of them cried. No matter how heavy the odds, he does not know defeat. That same convert volunteered to help guard Heydari House against any future attacks. An estimated 10,000 people gathered to hear Gandhi's prayers that evening. If the flames of communal strife envelop the whole country, Bapu asked, how can our newborn freedom survive? He awoke at 2 a.m. on August 15th, having slept through Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech at midnight. When he left Heydari House for his morning walk, crowds followed him, keen for just a glimpse of the Mahatma. Soon after he returned, West Bengal's cabinet arrived seeking his blessing. Wear the crown of thorns, Gandhi told them. Strive ceaselessly to cultivate truth and non-violence. Be humble, be forbearing, be aware of power. Power corrupts. Do not let yourselves be entrapped by its pomp and pageantry. Remember, you are in office to serve the poor in India's villages. How obvious it seemed to him now, that simple prescription for using power most wisely, and yet how long it had taken him to learn, and how difficult it was to avoid life's lures and traps, the pomp and the wrong passions.